In a quiet suburban neighborhood in California, the Williams family seemed like a picture-perfect example of the American dream. The house, neatly maintained with a well-kept lawn, sat on a peaceful street where neighbors waved as they passed by. Jennifer and Robert Williams, the parents, were in their early 30s and appeared to be living the life that many people aspired to. Jennifer worked part-time as a nurse, offering care to those in need, while Robert, a dedicated engineer, worked full-time at a reputable company. Together, they seemed to have built a solid life for themselves and their two children. The family's dynamic appeared to be one of love and stability. James, the 14-year-old son, was an active teenager, involved in sports and school activities. His younger brother, 2-year-old Noah, was the picture of innocence. His big brown eyes and infectious smile made him a favorite among family and friends, and the young boy had captured the hearts of everyone around him. The Williams family was frequently praised by their neighbors as the model family, the kind of family that others admired for their warmth and kindness. From the outside, the Williams household was everything one could hope for. The children were well-fed, attended good schools, and had access to all the resources they needed. Jennifer and Robert, though busy with their respective careers, always made time to support their kids in whatever endeavors they pursued. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form in their seemingly perfect family structure. James, the older of the two children, had always been a bright and ambitious child. From a young age, he was used to being the center of attention. His parents, particularly Jennifer, showered him with affection and praise, and he thrived in that environment. He was their firstborn, their pride and joy, and for many years he basked in the love and attention that his parents gave him. However, the arrival of Noah, the newborn baby brother, shifted everything for James. His life, once full of undivided attention from his parents, now seemed to revolve around the needs and demands of the infant. Noah, with his round cheeks and large, innocent eyes, was irresistible to everyone who met him. It didn't take long before Jennifer and Robert became completely captivated by their new son. They were doting parents, showering Noah with love and affection at every turn. As a toddler, Noah was charming and sweet, always with a smile on his face and an energy that was contagious. The attention that had once been solely James's was now divided, and James couldn't help but feel the weight of it. His parents, though they still loved him, were now focused on Noah's every need, every milestone, every moment of joy. For James, this change was a blow to his self-esteem. He began to notice how people fawned over Noah, how his younger brother was the center of attention, while he was left to fend for himself. At first, the shift seemed like a natural part of growing up. After all, his younger brother needed more care and attention at that age. But as time went on, the frustration James felt grew into something more sinister. He began to resent Noah, though he didn't fully understand why. The love that had once been lavished upon him was now spread thin, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being replaced. The jealousy James felt became more pronounced with each passing day. He couldn't help but compare himself to Noah, constantly measuring his own worth against the toddler who seemed to be winning everyone's affection. He was no longer the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Suddenly, Noah was the one receiving all the praise. The constant comparisons, both from his parents and from others, left James feeling invisible, overlooked, and unimportant. It was as though he had become an afterthought in the eyes of his family. As the months passed, James's behavior began to change. The boy who had once been bright, energetic, and confident became withdrawn, angry, and resentful. His grades in school started to slip, and he began to distance himself from his friends. He no longer found joy in the things he once loved. Sports, which had once been a passion for him, now felt like an obligation. His enthusiasm for school faded, replaced by bitterness and frustration. The more he tried to grab his parents' attention, the more they seemed preoccupied with Noah. No matter what he did, it never seemed to be enough. Ethan, the boy who had once been a joyful child, began to hide his emotions behind a mask. He put on a facade, pretending to be fine when, in reality, he felt completely lost. He began to bottle up his feelings, unsure of how to process the overwhelming emotions that were consuming him. His resentment for Noah grew, but he felt powerless to do anything about it. Every time he looked at his younger brother, he saw a reflection of the love and attention he no longer received. Jennifer and Robert, though concerned about James's growing distance, didn't fully understand the root of his behavior. They saw him as a typical teenager, going through the ups and downs of adolescence. They tried to talk to him, but James pushed them away, unwilling to admit the depth of his hurt. The more they tried to help, the more he resisted, unable to articulate the pain he felt from being overshadowed by Noah. Despite the growing tension at home, the Williams family continued to live in their bubble of suburban normalcy. Jennifer and Robert believed they were doing the best they could for both their children, never fully grasping the emotional turmoil James was experiencing. The cracks in their family dynamics continued to deepen, unnoticed by the parents who were caught up in their own lives. James, now filled with resentment and anger, reached a breaking point. He could no longer bear the weight of the jealousy he had felt for so long. His feelings of neglect and isolation had consumed him, clouding his judgment and distorting his sense of right and wrong. What had once been a simple sibling rivalry had now become a dangerous obsession, and the results would be devastating. The events that followed would change the Williams family forever. James couldn't remember exactly when it started, but he knew that something inside him was beginning to shift. At first it was subtle, a passing thought, a fleeting moment of irritation when Noah's innocent laughter filled the house. The baby, just 2 years old, was a constant source of attention, an endless well of love from their parents, Jennifer and Robert. What had once been James's domain, the center of his parents' world, was now taken up by his younger brother, who seemed to demand and receive all of their focus. James had always been their firstborn, the child who had felt the warmth of their attention and affection in every stage of his life. But that had changed with Noah's arrival. The joy Noah brought to their lives seemed to come at James's expense, and over time, the unease inside him grew. He couldn't understand why he felt the way he did. After all, it wasn't Noah's fault that he was born. But in James's mind, Noah had stolen the attention and love that had once been rightfully his. The more he watched his parents dote on Noah, the more resentful he became. He had been the one to struggle with school, to try hard and still fall short. But Noah seemed to get by effortlessly, even in his toddler years. He was the darling of the family, always the subject of conversation, always the focus of their care. The once playful sibling bond between them started to sour, turning into a bitter rivalry that James could neither escape nor fully comprehend. His feelings, however, weren't something he could express. He couldn't go to his parents and tell them that he was feeling left out, that Noah had taken something precious from him. He knew his parents loved him, but they didn't seem to see what was happening inside him. Every time he tried to talk to them about how he felt, they simply brushed it off as normal teenage behavior. They had always told him that sibling rivalry was something that everyone goes through. But this didn't feel like just a rivalry. This was something deeper, something darker. James's frustration started to boil over, but he had no one to share it with. His friends didn't understand, and he was too embarrassed to share his feelings with them. No one else in his life seemed to grasp the depth of his isolation. The more time passed, the more he felt alienated from everyone. His parents, his friends, and even Noah. At school, James's behavior became increasingly erratic. He had never been a stellar student, but now his grades started to slip even more. He didn't care about school anymore, couldn't focus on the lessons, and found himself drifting further away from his peers. He once had a group of friends, but over time, they too began to pull away. James couldn't relate to them. They didn't understand the way he felt. His emotional struggles, his sense of displacement, made it harder for him to form meaningful friendships. He would often find himself alone, either wandering the halls or sitting quietly by himself during lunch. The isolation at school mirrored the one he felt at home. The more he withdrew from others, the more the bitterness inside him festered. He began to develop a deep sense of resentment toward his parents. They were too preoccupied with Noah, with his needs, his health, and his milestones. They had become so consumed by caring for the baby that they failed to notice the changes in their older son. Every attempt James made to reach out for their attention seemed to fall flat, replaced by discussions about Noah's newest word or how he was growing so quickly. His parents never noticed the mounting frustration that clouded James's once bright spirit. The more they focused on Noah, the more James felt invisible, an afterthought in a family that had once revolved around him. This neglect, both emotional and physical, only deepened his anger. He began to feel as though he had been replaced, his worth diminishing with every moment he spent being overshadowed by his younger brother. The love that had once been his alone now seemed to be given away freely, and the resentment built up in his chest like a heavy stone. Every day was a struggle, and no matter what he did to try to reclaim the love he once had, Noah was always there, effortlessly taking everything from him. The jealousy that had begun as a simple rivalry between siblings slowly turned into an obsession. James began to despise the baby. He hated how everyone fawned over Noah, how he was always the center of attention, and how his parents seemed to forget that he existed at times. As the months passed, the emotional toll became unbearable. James's anger, once just a simmering frustration, now burned with intensity. The jealousy had turned to hate, and the hate made him feel more isolated than ever before. The more his parents ignored him, the more he resented Noah. The thought of being stuck in this family, constantly overshadowed by a child who was too young to understand, became too much to bear. James found himself fantasizing about a life without Noah, imagining what it would be like if he could finally get the attention he craved. The once beloved younger brother, who had brought so much joy into their lives, now represented everything that had taken away his sense of belonging. James's mind began to twist under the weight of these thoughts, and he started to feel a terrible satisfaction in imagining a future where he could finally reclaim his parents' love. But the more he focused on this idea, the darker it became. What had begun as a harmless jealousy transformed into a dangerous obsession, an obsession that began to consume every part of his mind. At times, when the house was quiet and Noah was asleep, James would sit in his room, trying to calm the storm in his head. He couldn't shake the resentment he felt every time he saw his parents' affectionate attention directed at Noah. The anger clouded his judgment, and the more isolated he felt, the harder it became to separate the reality of his emotions from the distorted fantasies running wild in his mind. The love he had once shared with his parents had been eroded by jealousy and neglect, and James was left with only a burning desire to escape the feeling of being overlooked, the feeling of being unloved. James's transformation from a bright and hopeful child into someone consumed by jealousy and resentment was heartbreaking, and the tension in the family grew with every passing day. His parents failed to recognize the signs, mistaking his withdrawal for the normal behavior of a teenager. But in reality, James had been spiraling deeper into a psychological state that he could no longer control. His mental health, neglected and ignored, deteriorated further as the hatred for Noah built within him. The tipping point for James came one evening, a seemingly ordinary night that would soon spiral into a tragic event. As usual, Noah, his 2-year-old brother, was a constant source of both joy and frustration. On this particular evening, however, Noah was particularly fussy. His cries filled the house, piercing through the walls of James's room where he sat stewing in his own emotions. Noah's cries were a familiar sound, one that had become synonymous with his presence in their home. For James, these sounds were more than just the normal noise of a toddler. They were a reminder of everything that had changed in his life since Noah's arrival. The more Noah cried, the more it seemed to pull their parents away from him. The more he felt invisible, alone in his own home. Jennifer, their mother, had always been attentive to Noah's needs, but tonight her patience seemed to be stretched thin. She walked from room to room, trying to soothe Noah, her voice calm and comforting as she rocked him back and forth. But for James, the more attention his mother lavished on Noah, the more he seethed with jealousy. The anger inside him began to boil over, and with each passing minute, the feelings of neglect he had carried for so long intensified. He watched helplessly as Jennifer's sole focus was on Noah, her eyes and hands never straying far from the toddler. Even Robert, his father, who had been a fixture of support for James in his early years, was now fully absorbed in trying to calm Noah. He cooed and whispered comforting words to the crying child, trying to soothe him to sleep, all the while leaving James feeling like a distant shadow in the background. The more James observed this scene, the more the darkness inside him grew. He felt a deep sense of bitterness and resentment, emotions that he had been struggling with for months. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at his parents, overwhelmed with feelings of jealousy and frustration. They were so focused on Noah's needs that they didn't seem to notice James slipping further away, retreating into his own mind. The love and attention that had once been his alone, the spotlight he had basked in for years, now belonged to Noah, and James could not stand it anymore. In the quiet of the room, as Noah's cries began to fade under his mother's soothing words, a dark thought crept into James's mind. What if Noah could just disappear? What if, by removing him from the equation, James could finally regain the attention he had longed for? What if, in taking away the source of his parents' obsession, he could restore balance to the family and make himself the center of their world once again? The thought was fleeting at first, almost as if his mind was trying to push it away, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed to make sense. Noah's presence had stolen everything from him: his parents' love, their time, their affection, and now he was going to take back what was his. The idea took root, and for the first time in a long while, James felt a sense of clarity. His jealousy, which had been festering for months, morphed into a cold desire for revenge. He felt trapped in a life that had no place for him, no room for his own needs or desires. He had been overshadowed, forgotten, and now it was time to act. His frustration, his anger, and the feeling of being neglected all collided in that moment, forming a dangerous and irrational impulse that James could no longer control. The rage that had been building inside him over the past few months finally erupted, and what was once a subtle undercurrent of jealousy became a violent, uncontrollable force. James, in his 14-year-old mind, saw no way out. He couldn't compete with the love Noah received. He couldn't get his parents to notice him, to pay attention to him, the way they once did. In his twisted reasoning, getting rid of Noah seemed like the only way to restore things to the way they had been. It was a way to reclaim his place, to ensure that he would no longer be left in the shadows. The horror of what he was thinking didn't fully sink in. All he could focus on was the thought of regaining his parents' love and attention. That night, the house was quieter than it had been in a long time. Noah, eventually lulled to sleep by Jennifer's constant attention, lay peacefully in his crib. James, on the other hand, was anything but peaceful. His mind raced, thoughts clouding his judgment, and a cold determination settled over him. The anger and jealousy that had consumed him for months had now coalesced into a terrifying resolution. His earlier hesitations faded into the background, and for the first time he was certain of what needed to be done. He believed, in that moment, that his actions would make everything right again. What had started as a child's petty jealousy had transformed into something much darker. James was no longer the innocent boy who once played with his toys and dreamed of the future. He had become a young man driven by a twisted desire for attention, for love, and for validation. The hours he had spent watching Noah receive everything he once had, the unrelenting jealousy, the bitterness, all of it came to a head in that moment. The seed of violence had been planted, and the darkness inside him was now all-consuming. It was no longer about competing for affection or fighting for attention. It had become a cold, calculated act of vengeance. As he stood there in the dim light of his room, James knew what he had to do. The intense rage that had been building for months now filled every corner of his mind. He had allowed his jealousy to fester, allowing it to turn into something uncontrollable, something horrifying. The desire to hurt Noah, to make him disappear, was no longer just a passing thought. It was a plan, an idea that he couldn't let go of, no matter how twisted it seemed. In the quiet of that night, when all seemed calm, the horrors that James would unleash were already taking shape in his mind. His jealousy had become his driving force, and in the darkness of his thoughts, he was ready to act. This tragic moment, born out of jealousy, neglect, and frustration, would mark the beginning of a nightmare no one could have seen coming. James's decision would set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the course of his life and destroy the family he had once been a part of. The rage that had consumed him would lead him to commit an unforgivable act, an act that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The house was silent, cloaked in the hush of night, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards that always seemed louder in the dark. James had waited for this moment with a sick anticipation knotted deep in his stomach. He had memorized every sound of the house, every breath and stir from his parents' room, every faint murmur of Noah's dreams. Now, as the clock ticked past 2, The only sound was Noah's slow, rhythmic breathing through the cracked door. The world outside remained asleep. Inside, James moved with rehearsed precision. He opened the garage doors slowly, careful not to let it creak, and retrieved the bottle he had hidden days ago. A half-used canister of lighter fluid left near the toolbox. It felt heavier than it had before, or maybe that was just the weight of what he was about to do. He walked up the stairs in total silence, barefoot, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped the plastic bottle. Every step felt like a scream in his ears, but no one stirred. When he reached Noah's door, he pushed it open an inch more, just enough to slide inside. The room was bathed in the soft blue glow of a nightlight, shaped like a whale, casting gentle shadows across the walls. Noah lay curled up on his side, thumb pressed against his lip, blanket half twisted around his tiny legs. He looked so small, so peaceful. James stood there for a moment, almost wavering, but something dark within him had already won. It had been winning for months, fed by neglect, jealousy, and a desperate hunger to be seen. He unscrewed the cap and leaned over the bed, carefully beginning to pour. The chemical smell hit him first, sharp and raw, burning his nostrils. He gagged slightly but didn't stop. He worked quickly, methodically, like he had seen people do on television, making sure not to leave dry spots. Noah stirred once, murmuring something unintelligible, but didn't wake. James stepped back when it was done, the bottle nearly empty, and stared at the soaked fabric clinging to his brother's skin. His hands shook, his heart thundered in his chest. There was a sick satisfaction twisting inside him, mixing with revulsion. He felt alive, in control, like the invisible boy had finally become someone impossible to ignore. He struck the match. It flared with a soft crackle. For a moment, he simply held it, watching the flickering flame dance on the tip. Then he let it fall. The effect was instant. A flash, a whoosh of fire, and the bed lit up like dry leaves in autumn. The heat surged up toward him, driving him back. Noah's body convulsed, a strangled scream piercing the air. It was a terrible sound, raw, primal, animal. The flames leapt higher, feeding hungrily on the synthetic fibers of the pajamas, the mattress, the sheets. The smell was overwhelming. Plastic, skin, chemicals. It filled James's nose and eyes, making them burn. Still, he didn't move. He watched, frozen, as his brother writhed and shrieked. The sound stabbed into him, echoed in his skull. Then, almost suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was louder than the scream. Noah's body no longer moved. The flames crackled louder now, licking the walls, jumping to the stuffed animals, the curtains, the floor. Smoke curled upward in thick black waves, rolling across the ceiling, smothering the glow of the nightlight. James stumbled back, coughing, his eyes wide, stinging, watering. Panic clutched at his chest. The walls seemed to tilt. The heat bore down on him like a furnace. But he still didn't run. He backed out into the hallway, watching the doorframe now lit from within by orange flame. He didn't scream. He didn't try to save Noah. The fire alarm blared a few seconds later, a shrill, useless wail. He heard his mother shout from the other side of the house. His father's footsteps thundered against the floor. But James just stood there in the hallway, the bottle of lighter fluid still in his hand, melted slightly from the heat. His face was blank, unreadable. Deep inside, he already knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The act was done. The silence was permanent. The boy who no one noticed had just carved himself into their lives forever. As the flames devoured the small room, James remained motionless for a few long seconds, as if hypnotized by the destruction he had set in motion. The walls pulsed with heat, the fire curling in waves up the furniture, hungrily reaching for the ceiling. In that moment, he felt untouchable. No sorrow, no guilt, just a strange, hollow stillness that filled every inch of his chest. It was as if the noise in his mind, the pounding voice of resentment that had echoed inside him for months, had suddenly gone quiet. The world around him was dissolving in flame, yet he felt lighter, freed from the invisible burden that had shadowed him since the day Noah came home from the hospital, and everything changed. For once, it wasn't Noah who was being held, kissed, fed, praised. It was James who had acted, who had done something irreversible. But that stillness didn't last. The roar of the fire began to overtake his thoughts. The heat pressed in, the The smoke thickened. His throat burned. He turned and stumbled out of the room, shutting the door behind him as if that could contain the chaos within. The handle was already hot beneath his hand. The hallway was quiet, the rest of the house still cloaked in night. James walked away quickly, nearly tripping over his own feet, heading back toward his own room. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the sudden clarity of what he had done. Every step took him farther from the blaze, but not from the consequences. He tried to settle beneath his blankets, forced his body to lie still, to pretend it was all normal. But normal was gone. The cries came minutes later. Noah's muffled, strangled sounds echoed through the walls like a final plea for help. James flinched but did not move. Then came the sudden gasps of his parents waking. First Jennifer, then Robert. Their voices cut through the air, confused and rising in urgency. Doors opened, footsteps pounded down the hallway. The smoke had begun to slip under Noah's door and trail across the ceiling. As they reached the room, their screams shattered the stillness of the house. What greeted them was a vision of hell. Flames leapt out of Noah's room the moment the door was pulled open. A wall of heat knocked Jennifer back as she screamed her son's name. The fire had taken hold of everything. The mattress, the curtains, the walls, toys melted in pools of plastic. The ceiling bubbled with soot. And in the center of it all was the broken, unrecognizable figure of a child. Robert tried to get closer, stepping into the room, only to be driven back by the heat and smoke. It was too late. The scent of burning fabric and flesh choked the air, and all they could do was collapse against the hallway walls in horror. Jennifer sobbed, clutching her chest, while Robert fumbled to call emergency services with shaking hands. The fire spread quickly. The smoke detectors screamed, piercing through the rest of the house. James remained in his bed, feigning confusion, when his parents shouted. He listened as the chaos unfolded around him, every sound punctuating the truth he could no longer outrun. He imagined their faces, Jennifer's twisted in anguish, Robert's eyes wide with disbelief, and still he felt nothing that resembled remorse, only distance. As if the boy they were grieving had never truly been his brother, just a symbol of everything James had lost. By the time the fire department arrived, the upper floor was choking with smoke. Firefighters stormed in with heavy boots and axes, yelling over the roar of the flames. They broke windows, dragged hoses through the yard, and poured water into the blaze that had reduced Noah's room to ruin. But it was too late for heroics. There was no child to rescue, no cry to follow, just silence and smoke and ash. The firemen found the charred remnants of the bed, the scorched bones of toys, and a body barely intact. One of them turned away and vomited in the hallway. Inside, neighbors gathered in their pajamas, drawn by the sirens and the flashing red lights. Some clutched robes to their chests. Others stood with hands pressed over mouths. Whispers rose among them of faulty wiring, of a tragic accident. Jennifer was led into the ambulance, her legs weak beneath her, her face drained of color. Robert stood silent, holding her hand, staring into the rising smoke like it might still carry an answer. Inside the house, the scent of gasoline lingered beneath the smoke, a detail unnoticed at first, buried under the layers of grief and confusion, but it would not remain hidden for long. Investigators would come. They would sift through the ruins, examine the patterns, trace the source. The story that had started as a terrible accident would begin to unravel, and with it, the carefully constructed mask James wore. But for now, in those first hours of shock and mourning, no one suspected the boy who sat alone in his room, eyes wide, face blank. No one looked closely enough to see the absence of tears or the way his gaze never met theirs. The night had taken one child, but it had marked another forever. The arrest came swiftly, before the morning light could even settle on the scorched bones of the Williams home. The fire investigators hadn't finished their sweep when officers pulled James aside, questioned him quietly, and noticed the absence of ash or soot on his clothes. He was oddly composed, too composed for a boy who had just lost his baby brother to a house fire. The suspicion crept in like smoke, slow, silent, unmistakable. When they found the empty bottle of lighter fluid discarded behind the garage, the pieces began to fall into place. James was taken into custody while Jennifer collapsed in the living room, her voice hoarse from screaming, her eyes glazed with a pain that couldn't find words. Robert didn't move for minutes, just stared at the squad car as it pulled away with their son in the back seat. his silhouette still and small behind the glass. News of the crime spread through the town like a second fire. Parents clutched their children a little tighter. Teachers at James's middle school stared blankly at his yearbook photo, unable to reconcile the smiling boy with the horror that had unfolded. People remembered him as quiet, maybe a little withdrawn, but polite, ordinary. He played basketball after school, rode his bike to the gas station for sodas, helped his neighbors take out the trash. No one had seen the storm building inside him. The idea that someone so young, so seemingly harmless, could do something so calculated and monstrous shattered the town's sense of safety. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath their feet. If this could happen in their neighborhood, it could happen anywhere. The investigation unearthed what the surface had long concealed. James had been drowning in silence. Since the birth of Noah, he had slowly faded from the center of his parents' world. The photos on the wall had shifted, fewer of him, more of the baby. The laughter at the dinner table grew shorter, the affection more divided. He wasn't abused, not in the traditional sense. He was simply overlooked, passed over, forgotten. But that quiet neglect festered. His grades slipped, his teachers called home, but nothing changed. He spent more time alone, sitting in his room with headphones on, watching the walls close in. No one noticed the darkness taking root. Not until it was too late. Psychologists assigned to the case spoke of emotional disintegration, of identity loss, of a desperate need to reclaim control in a life that felt invisible. The court documents painted a tragic picture. A child who felt discarded, trying to make himself known in the most horrifying way imaginable. It wasn't sudden, they said. It had been building for years. The murder was the final act in a play no one knew they were watching. The prosecutors laid out the timeline, how James had taken the lighter fluid days before, how he'd waited until the house was silent, how he'd watched Noah sleep before setting the match. The cold detail of it stunned the courtroom into silence. Even seasoned officers admitted they had never seen anything like it from someone so young. Jennifer and Robert sat through the trial like shadows of their former selves. Jennifer's hands trembled constantly, her eyes rimmed red. Robert's posture remained rigid, as if he might crumble if he moved too much. They listened to the forensic analysts, the fire reports, the statements from school counselors who had once tried to warn them that James was withdrawing. None of it made sense. They couldn't understand how their son, their firstborn, had turned into something they didn't recognize. They grieved for Noah, but also for the boy they thought they knew. It wasn't just one child they had lost. It was both. The courtroom verdict came down with cold finality. James was to be placed in a juvenile detention facility until he turned 21, with the possibility of further psychiatric care thereafter. He showed no visible emotion when the sentence was read. Some believed he was numb. Others feared he was beyond feeling. Whatever the truth, the damage was irreversible. The Williams family was left with a nursery full of ashes, a silent bedroom, and a wound that time would not touch. The town tried to return to normal, but there was always something broken in the air. The house on Maple Street stood boarded up for months before being torn down entirely. Flowers left on the sidewalk turned brown and shriveled under the weight of winter. At school, James's name was removed from honor rolls, his locker emptied and cleaned. No one wanted the memory, but no one could forget. Parents whispered about what more they could do, what signs they might be missing in their own homes. Counselors were brought into schools. Seminars were held, but nothing erased what had happened. In the quiet that followed the headlines, the Williams family fractured further. Jennifer stopped attending church. Robert barely spoke. They lived like strangers in the same house, bound together by shared loss and separated by the blame they couldn't say aloud. Some nights, Jennifer would walk into Noah's old room, what was left of it, and stand there, frozen, as if expecting to hear him laugh again. Other nights, she would wake from dreams where James was still a little boy, smiling and reaching for her hand. The death of a child is an unspeakable sorrow, but what tore through the Williams family was something deeper, a collapse from within. The horror hadn't come from the outside. It had been born in their own home, in the overlooked corners, the unnoticed silences, the quiet cries for attention. It was a reminder to the world that monsters aren't always strangers. Sometimes they are children, made not born, shaped by what they lack and what they long for. What happened that night became more than just a crime. It became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when love fails to reach where it's most needed. The memory of Noah lingered like smoke in the air, impossible to scrub clean. But so did the memory of James, not just as a murderer, but as a boy who might have been saved if only someone had seen him in time.